yourselves, and then Yacho, I'd love for you to just take over, actually, and tell us why you commissioned the research, and we have a presentation that you'll share, and that everyone will contribute to. So.
Yes, thank you very much, Kesia. It's really a pleasure and honor to be part of this conversation as Access to Finance Rwanda. So we are a not-for-profit company which is driving financial inclusion and financial sector development in Rwanda for the last decade. We are part of a network of what we call FSDs, Financial Sector Development Trusts, across Sub-Saharan Africa. So we are very keen to join the participants here and the members to really discuss and see, but also do something in this space. So recently I don't know whether probably I give the space to Fatou for introduction, and then I come back.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Fatou Dieye. I am a free agent these days, which feels liberating but also scary. I'm an architect by training with a passion for affordable housing, and I'm happy to be able to contribute to this project and hopefully to others. Thank you.
And Ilana, you've joined us from Cape Town.
Yes, hi. Lovely to be with you. Thank you so much for having me. Ilana from a company called 71.4, and it was a great pleasure to work on the project with Fatou and Kesia.
Excellent. Yacho, would you like the slides to go up now? Should we do that?
Yes, they should.
Great. I believe you're launching the research today.
That's correct.
It
is indeed. Data has always been a problem, but I would say that we have really brought a contribution towards resolving this problem of data. So I'll probably be talking as we look for the slides to come. So we've commissioned, probably before we commission, I talk about commissioning this study, I just wanted to say that any investor or developers in the room or those really willing to come to Rwanda, they have two major questions. First is really to get data, to understand what is happening, what's the landscape. Number two, they want to understand about the enabling environment. Is policy right? Do you have the legal structures that can enable the investment? Are there any other market infrastructure that would support the investment? So we saw that there was quite a gap, because really we had information in different organizations, in different surveys, including our own, but really bring them together to bring out an information that would be useful to investors in this affordable housing space was quite critical. So that's why we came up with correct, good. So we came up with this discussion with the Center for Affordable Housing in Africa and different stakeholders or funders, and we said we need to do something around this problem. So we designed a study, affordable housing in Rwanda and its financing opportunities. So we are lucky to partner with Kesia and team, and that was very important because we needed really to get the right experts in the room so that we get right deliverables. So what we are presenting today is really high-level summary of the key highlights of the report. But at the end of this session, we shall share a link on our website so you can get the full report and read it and see how it would be useful for you. So we are covering first the demand side, as Kesia said, and that will be done by Ilana. And then we go to the supply side by Fatou. We look at key challenges that were found in the space, and then we shall insist on what finance can do to unlock some of the opportunities in this space. So I don't want to take much of your time. I just wanted to introduce Fatou to take us through the next slides. Probably I can hand over this just to... So slides are the right one. Oh, sorry, Elena, sorry. So I'll be Scrolling.
Right.
It's not moving. No. Okay. So,
Great.
Ilana,
Next
you
slide,
can
Hannah.
come. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you so much, Yashi. Thank you. So just as a precursor, the data that we used are two principal data sources. The one is FinScope, and the other is the ERCV, which is an income and expenditure survey that's done by the statistical agency in Rwanda. And as is the joy of anyone who knows who's worked with survey data, when you work with two different surveys, you tend to find two different answers sometimes to some critical questions. But I think we like to use them, different data sources, because well, the one thing we know about survey data is that the answer that you're getting out of a survey is wrong. It's statistically correct. So we've got a nice sample size. In both cases, the samples were robust and selected appropriately. But as is the case with all survey data, you've got a confidence interval that you're working with, and we'll show you the point estimates, but there's some scope and error, margin for error around the point estimates. So if we just started with a picture of all households in Rwanda, about 2.8 million households, and you can see roughly a quarter would be urban at the moment. And if you look at the Vision 2050 document and you look at projections of households in Rwanda, obviously that urbanization rate expected to be higher, that urbanization level expected to be higher. And so if we sort of scroll forward sort of 30 years to 2050, we would see more than that, sort of closer to 3.5 million households alone in urban areas in Rwanda. So it's a very significant challenge, the housing challenge in Rwanda. We can go to the next slide. If we just look at the characteristics of those households according to the survey data while we're waiting for the next slide to come up. What's really interesting with the data is that you can start to get a sense of what does a household look like? Who is this person or this customer that you're hoping to sell a property to? And when you see for 2 slides, she'll show you pictures of houses, and we haven't got pictures of people in the presentation, but I think it's really important that you start to imagine, who is it that you're building for? Is this a young professional who's single and this is their first sort of a foray out of their parents' home into their own property? Are they going to be renting? Are they going to be owning? Looking at questions around life stage, particularly whether there are 2 income earners in the family. Is this a married couple, both of whom are employed? Are there children? These are all the questions that I think property developers need to obviously engage with when you're kind of looking at the data, not only because you want to get a sense of what the needs of the household would be, but also in terms of what's available for, what kind of spending is available for housing. Actually, I'm not sure if we're on the next slide yet. I don't see the slides in front of me, but I'm going to scroll down the presentation that I've got on my machine and just talk to characteristics of some of the household, and particularly things like tenure. If we look at FinScope and we look predominantly, yes? Sorry, I can't, okay.
Can you see the slide?
I can't see the slides.
Okay.
Okay, no,
You need to go
I don't see the slide.
You can't see this.
But that's fine. I'm on slide 5. So I hope that's
Slide 5.
Okay. Cool. I apologize for this. I would much rather have been there in person. But such is. Okay, there we go. So if we look at slide 5, you can see we're looking at urban areas. Roughly 70% would say they own, with 28% renting. This is according to FinScope. If we look at the data from the ERCV, we'd actually find a much higher proportion of households who are renting. And the critical question there obviously is who they're renting from. This is not an institutional landlord that they're renting from. It's typically another household. So I think when you think of supply and demand, to sort of think of them often together, because you have so many landlords, and Fatu will talk to this, so many landlords who are households themselves, so they at the same time consume and supply housing. And I think that just puts a different lens on the way we think about the market a little bit. Obviously the rental market is an urban phenomenon, and that's not unusual to Rwanda. In most cases, people are saying that they build their own dwellings, and that would apply across urban and rural. And I think the question that's in everyone's mind is whether that's going to take Rwandan cities to where they need to be in the future. Is this a pattern of housing investment that will yield the outcomes that I think everyone, the land use master plan is looking for and everyone else is looking for in Rwanda around densification, for instance, and around the unit sizes. Obviously, the critical characteristic for Rwanda that so many of us working on the continent are in awe of is the fact that so many people have got title deeds, and typically in their name. So in South Africa, a lot of people have got title deeds, but there's someone else's name on the title deed. So I think that's a critical asset that you're working with, that we do have land ownership. Of course, it does create some issues on the other side. The next slide just talks to the issue of secondary cities. I mean, in so many cases, we only focus on one city in a country, and again, this is common across the continent, where there's one dominant city, certainly the case in Rwanda, but a lot of the discussion in the planning documents talk about the need to create secondary cities. It's just not possible for one city to house the population, and this is just some data on the differences across Rwanda in some of the cities. So you can see some cities would have noticeably different levels of access to services, and I just want to highlight the one just second from the bottom, percentage of access to a flush toilet. And it's always this question that we would ask: do you have a housing problem or do you have a sanitation problem? Or maybe let's frame it differently: do you have a housing opportunity or do you have a sanitation opportunity? And you can see access to flush toilets is very low. And again, looking at the sanitation plans and thinking about how that might change and what would need to happen, obviously top of mind for developers. Access to electricity, pretty high, and you can see this issue of overcrowding, not as high as we see in a couple of other cities. So it's giving you this picture across the major sort of secondary cities and Kigali, and I think very interesting to think about again the future, and we'll talk a little bit about employer-based housing, in particular around industrial parks. Just moving on to the next slide there. I think we skipped a slide. If you want to just move on to slide number 8. This is where we're looking at income distribution, because I think this is critical. This is really the critical issue, is just looking at incomes, because affordability is very constrained at the moment. And again, to emphasize, this is survey data. So where you're looking at a relatively small population of income earners above, let's say, the 500,000 franc mark, which would be equivalent to, let's say, $500 a month, you've got a very small sample size. And again, your margin of error is going to be there. And I think really for us looking at this work, and just kind of thinking, well, we need to bring in other data sources. So we need to bring in some administrative data. The Rwandan Revenue Authority, for instance, has great data on what incomes actually are. You know, people in surveys don't report this very well. Even where they're salaried, often they understate their incomes. We also would want to use some other data to try and understand, you know, families where there are 2 income earners, not just 1 income earner, because that makes a critical difference, obviously. But the picture that you're seeing here, urban households, rural households, very different patterns. And then when you take this, and just remember the dark green is the urban, the light green is the rural, and you superimpose on this, what are people actually spending on housing? What can they afford to spend on housing? We've got this magic number that everyone in the sector uses, 30%. No one knows where that 30% comes from. But we've yet to see a country where people spend 30% of their incomes on housing in Africa. And if we go to the next slide, what we've done there is just take a couple of scenarios where we're looking at, you know, different kinds of housing products and different kinds of financing instruments, and saying, okay, how many households could afford this product using this financing mechanism? And you can see the numbers are pretty low. And I think that that's, again, bear in mind margin of error, but again, why we would want to motivate for better administrative data to understand incomes in a lot more detail. I think when we start to look at the unsecured loans, and we know that that's a very feasible mechanism for a lot of households. You can see the dark green would be the urban households, the light green, the rural households, completely feasible, but in an urban setting. Is this kind of incremental housing going to get Kigali and other cities to where they need to be in terms specifically of densification? So I'm going to leave that as a question and then hand over back to you, Yachi, for the rest of the presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ilana, for the insights. Move to Fatou. I think they continue helping us in moving the slides. So next, please.
Pardon me. Let's see if we can make this happen. Okay, so I had the opportunity to work with the team and take care of the supply. So really start to look at who is supplying what to the market. Are those products, do they match the data that Ilana just showed you about people's ability to pay? And if there's a mismatch, what can we possibly do? And what finance solutions could come in to be able to bridge that gap, to be able to match our supply with our demand? So that's where I started. And what we quickly did was look over the last 10 years, what has actually been built? This is just a sampling. It's not every project that's out there. What are some of the prices? Who's providing rental housing, actually? These are just in terms of the formal developers, and we were able to divide them up into 4 different categories. So the lowest category on the bottom is the local developers, people building between 10 and 50 units per year. Local developers who are building between 50 and 100 dwelling units per year. And then some local developers, there are a few out there, who are building over 100 units per year. And then, of course, the top category, which was the international developers who are looking to build 500 plus units every year. And so what we see is that nobody's really providing rental, except at the very top of the pyramid, in the formal market. So then the question is, we know people are renting, where is that rental market actually appearing? And so after having a look at this, we came up with 4 major findings. Next slide, please. Okay, and those findings, finding number 1, few dwelling units, formal dwelling units have been built. So about fewer than 3,000 were done through these developer channels. And that's too few when we're looking at the numbers that Vision 2050 is expecting us to hit. We have a lot of work to do, and the question is, how can we do that differently? And part of it starts with this type of exercise where we look at the problem differently. And so what we see is that people in Rwanda have a place to live. So if the big developers aren't delivering it, who is actually delivering it? There are a whole host of micro developers, some informal and some formal, who are providing that housing to the public. Let's look at them. Let's see what's working for them and see how we can begin to take that forward. The second finding is that for some of the big projects, and we have some big players here, it's the pace that they're trying to move and the pace of the policy, the subsidy policy, sometimes hasn't been in sync. So there have been stops. We are very optimistic that they will be able to move forward, but that's part of the reason why their delivery has also been limited. The third finding is, frankly, no one's building at the bottom of the pyramid. It's just not financially interesting for a lot of people, and there's also a lot of risk. There's a lot of financial exposure for developers who are having to cover to make sure that their offtake happens, because offtake is not guaranteed, and then to also be able to finance their construction. So people are risk averse, which means that the only project really that was under 10 million was Batsinda 1, and that was in 2008. So really, we have to figure out a way to be able to deliver. You saw the numbers that Ilana presented. We need to have an 8 million, 10 million, 5 million, as well as the 50 million product. And the fourth finding is that, built to code rental barely exists, which means that all of the rental that you and I both know about, I know I'm a renter, all of that's happening, it's invisible. And that is a huge source of money which could really power the housing market. And so we have to figure out a way to look and examine that rental space and be able to move it forward so that we can create a rental market and also be able to grow the overall formal housing market. Next. And so what we did is the methodology that we used took 3 initial steps. So the first step was to say, okay, housing is not a monolith here in Rwanda. There are so many things happening. How can we look at the houses that are there and divide them into what we're calling submarkets? And how can, by doing this submarket exercise, how can we make the invisible, the rental market, everything that's happening in the unplanned settlements, how can we begin to make that visible? And if it's visible, can we finance it, and can we use it to grow our housing market? That was step number 1, understanding that it's not a monolith. Step number 2 was to look at the value chain. The value chain has 7 links, land, infrastructure, blah, 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 all the way through design, construction, offtake, et cetera. If you look at each one of these delivery channels in each one of those submarkets, how can you then start to understand the value chain blockages that are happening per submarket? And then you can begin to design products to be able to address those submarket bottlenecks. That became really critical in the approach, and I have to admit it was actually also quite a bit of fun. And then the third part was to marry Alana's numbers with the submarket. So if we have these 6 different submarkets, how many people are actually in those markets? And what should be our focus? If a submarket is really small, should we be writing all of our policy for that? Or should we be shifting to something else? Next. So here are the submarkets, quickly, because I realize I'm going over time. So there are 6 submarkets, moving from left to right, from informal to formal. Each one of these submarkets has a specific urban morphology. That's the first line. So the way that those neighborhoods would eventually need to be planned needs to be taken into consideration. The second line, the type of housing that's actually being delivered, the materiality, whether they have access to infrastructure, et cetera, also differs. The third is just the typologies that are being delivered in each one of these submarkets. The numbers that you see, that's roughly, and I say very rough, the average cost per square meter to build that. And then the last line is who's actually living in that. So the first 2 submarkets are mostly owner-occupied. People are providing their own homes, which is why up until now, the fact that there isn't housing being delivered in that market doesn't mean that those people are homeless. They're self-supplying. And then, of course, you can move further. What we did do was include a submarket which is called employee housing. And that is precisely to address the policy aspect. Vision 2050 really is relying on employee housing to be a big component of the overall housing market in the future. And so we thought, let's look at it now, even though it's small, and figure out how it works so that we can begin to write and rethink the implementation policies so that it can actually be able to work as planned in the policies. Next. And so then this was the fun part, was taking Alana's numbers and being able to match and say how many people are in those submarkets. Again, margin of error, it all has to do with how you pick the data, but we really spent time with the EICV data to figure out, okay, how many households are actually in each one of these submarkets. And as you can see, most of the people are living in submarkets 1, 2, and 3, and our policies, which are very much focused towards developers, which is totally understandable, few households, around 10,000 households are actually concerned by that issue. And in that small market, most of those people already have houses. They might have 2, they might have 3, and they're actually the people who are supplying rental housing for some of the other submarkets. And what we also realize is that a lot of people aren't in only one. They might be living in one submarket and renting in another, or building housing for another. So there's really this fluidity across submarkets that's happening that really merits investigation, and that's the kind of approach that the research did. And my last slide, next, is this one, is if we start to look by Kigali and all the secondary cities to see what is the percentage of the different submarkets. And you can see that our developer, again, which is the blue, the big scale developer, which is currently the target of our policies, is a small fraction of the actual households and their demand profiles. And that mostly the first 2 submarkets, which is owner supplied and that informal rental housing, that's the majority of our rental market. So those people are actually our biggest housing suppliers. They are small developers. How do we formalize them, and how can finance actually be able to start to address their particular problems, their bottlenecks in each one of their submarkets to be able to offer more housing formally to the market every year? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Fatou. Probably to the next slide quickly, just to see what finance can do, really to enable the Vision 2050 to come into reality. So we've also assessed these aspects and discussing with different stakeholders in the market. As you all know, really finance is a key enabler for different sectors that are in the economy, and we thought it's very critical that we look at this aspect and provide some guidance. Apart from being an enabler, really, finance also can influence quality in terms of delivery of housing, affordable housing, but also Mzee Suleiman talked about standards, the green agenda that is there. So how do we actually take all the 3 together and ensure that the delivery is meeting those standards, but also building sustainably? So we looked at end user finance, which is quite key. I know already that different players in the market are doing tremendous job. The program that the DG Rwanda Housing Authority presented to us is already good movement towards addressing some of the challenges. But really the need, as you saw, is very huge from the demand side data analysis. So we want to join the other practitioners in this place to see how we can provide or support, catalyze end user financing, both through the means that are already there, or supporting the players, banks, microfinance institutions, SACCOs. I heard good stories about what SACCOs can do in Kenya. We already have a huge movement around SACCOs, those really in financial service provision, but also cooperatives that are into farming. They can actually support each other to own a home, a shelter. So that's very critical. But also something very important is we're having a discussion about expenditure patterns. And you find that when people are considering buying or owning a home, especially the young ones, they feel like they will get that when they get married and they have an estimate of which size of the household will be. Then they wait for that opportunity. But really, rent to own or rent actually as you save for the long-term goal that you have, I think we require some education around. So creating awareness about technologies that are there, but also financial education to know how do I plan to own a home. It's very critical. So shifting those consumption or the expenditures into consumption towards investment, which is really housing, is very critical. So we also look at construction finance, which is the second aspect. It's very critical that as you avail financing for the end users through different channels that are available, you need to look also at the supply side. How do we enable the developers and the investors in this space to also access appropriate financing? It's very critical. So these would be some of the discussions to have going forward to ensure that all the actors within the value chain are supported to get financing. Next slide. So I think I've talked about saving and income opportunities, but really there are different sources of income. First, we have remittances. I mean, from urban areas to rural or semi-urban locations. We have remittances from abroad that I would call semi or also permanent, actually. How do you leverage on that to look at affordability? Because some of the times lenders they overlook that, yet it's a steady income that is coming in. They are waiting for a salary or an income they can see and the source is clear, but even that one can be really tracked and then you showcase that it can help. We are looking at different schemes. RSSB, I know, has a new scheme, AUHF, which is supporting people in the informal sectors to save for old age. And that is, they already have a component. We're part of that in the design. I know there's a component where you can take 40% of the savings or the assets that you have accumulated, use it to support you get a home. And I know the role of insurance. We already have a product that was introduced back in 2012 and still there, but banks have it. But I don't know why they don't actually talk about it much. The collateral replacement indemnity. So it's there. So and I see most of the banks or the lenders insisting on the 30%, 20% down payment. Yeah, these people are struggling. They are renting, they can actually repay, but give them an opportunity to own a home and then see how that comes. So digitization is a very key aspect. Leveraging technology really to showcase the revenue streams, but also demonstrating credit worthiness of end users is very critical. And that visibility, I think that's what the lenders want to see, or investors actually. Then landlordism is another aspect that you find that in Kigali, I think Fatou talked about it. I mean, there's so many people that really, because they see, they want to look for a sector where they can monitor the inflows easily, it's safe, I have an asset. And most Rwandans, especially in urban and semi-urban cities, they are actually investing. After you have your own home, the second aspect is getting, can I actually build and rent? So no one is actually providing that data to show what is there. Those are actually small-scale developers. If you go to them, they can actually do wonders in this space because they probably have understood the market needs. I want probably the next one, so to move quickly. No, I think we can move to the next, the last one, so that I have time. Next. Yes. So as probably I highlighted, end user finance and construction finance is very critical. As you saw, I mean, the data, being a development finance institution, we care about those people that really are not part of the priorities for different players in the market. So we want to catalyze change towards actually serving people below 500,000 as an income per month. And when I talk about that, it's not just the salary, but how do we bring visibility into different streams of income so that the lender can be comfortable actually to provide any solutions. The other aspect we want to look at is the enabling environment, just to make sure that that environment supports low-income households and small-scale suppliers of housing to really support this Vision 2050 for everyone to own a home. So we'll have partnerships with different players already in the market. I've been interacting with some of you and took your cards. So we are into the design phase, and really we want to hear from everyone so that we are better informed as we design the intervention. So the last slide, I just wanted to say that this link, you can go to our website, that's the link. You get the full report. All these insights are there. You can read it, you can talk to us. We're happy even to share specific sections in more details that can help you either invest or support really end users to own a home. Thank you very much. Fatu, over to you. And Casey.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that I'd love to hear some questions. We've got about 8 minutes left. To wrap the whole effort, I think, in one ribbon, what we were trying to do in this project was to be real about who's on the demand side and who's on the supply side. And a recognition that not only in Rwanda, but in fact, I'd say across every single country in this continent, there is a significant part, and in some cases, perhaps even the majority of the population that we're overlooking, because we're not anticipating what we call informal market activity or informal earners, and to recognize the breadth of the population that exists outside of the so-called formal systems, and interrogate what it is that defines people as formal or informal. And what I was very excited about in this work and in the exercise that we did together was to really tease apart, especially on the supply side, those different submarkets, because they need different interventions, don't they? Yeah. Any questions from the floor? Yes, a question here. Charles, will you? I've lost my mic. I can't deliver one. I think a question is that next to Derek is the closest I can't see who it is. Please introduce yourself.
I'm called Stephen Sabiti from the Institute of Engineers Rwanda. Actually, mine is not a question per se, it's a comment. A comment on something that bothers me every day, that Fatu talked about on formalizing small developers. We have a very, very serious problem in this country of people who build to sell. And they build very poor product, and the moment you purchase that house, you're going to incur between 10 to 20% trying to repair the same house. So we think that is a sector that seems to not be regulated at all, And people are bringing products that are so very, very poor, and people are incurring a lot of cost in repairing those houses. We really beg that access to finance looks into how these small players who are here and there, how they can be assisted, form some companies that can construct houses that are of quality, and then involve even other players to make sure this sector is regulated. Thank you so much.
Let's take a couple more questions.
Kesha, if I may just comment on what he said. I'm here. It's very interesting that an engineer would complain about delivery that is substandard. That's on a lighter note. But maybe for everybody's information, there is lack of regulation from, in other markets, it's called defects liability or construction liability. And there's quite a number of developers in this room. So what happens practically is that it will vary from one contractor to the developer or from one developer to the client. So it is very subjective. I know Eddie is in the room. It's probably something that we need to take up. I know I saw Leopold as well. That's probably something that we need to take up at a much higher level. It's something that is indeed a very genuine concern here. Thanks. Mr. Solomon has a comment.
Sorry, I don't want to patronize, but in Jali, Mount Jali, Misegara, and Banyahi, they studied a lot about how the people, the person who owns, he have also 1 or 2 or 3 bedroom for rentals, which is in one property, you have 3 family, which is a way also goes by to the city to give rentals to the people for less commuting. Now, we tried in our project, Buiza Riverside, to make a house with 2 entrances. The top 2 bedroom with 1 bath divided into WC and shower with each one lavabo, and the down a full house with a big bedroom, salon that can be divided, kitchen and bath. We found out that if the regulation allow a person who makes less than 500,000, which today no house is available, he will pay 150. And the rest of the mortgage, which is $100, 100,000, he can make between 50 and 70,000 each room. So this, what I'm suggesting is to allow in the eligibility, because that you will handle with 1 house, 3 family. And as he moves his progress and his salaries and his family, he can then after cancel. And the other guy with a less rentals, he can save money and make down payment for to be ownership. This I would like you discuss with the people who make policy to make it happen. We have 1 house like that you can visit after tomorrow.
Thank you so much. You're close by, I can't skip you.
Thank you for sharing that good presentation. So there is something I may have missed in the presentation that I just want to clarify. So number 1 is, I saw some numbers that shows that in the urban areas, it's about 70% home ownership. I don't know whether that is that was accurate based on what I saw. And that in the rural areas, it's even higher, higher than that. And so that calls the question whether you actually have a market. But the important thing I wanted to ask was, what is the deficit actually in terms of home ownership?
Tough ones are coming. Anyone else? Probably, yes, I'll move.
One more question, I think. It's hard to see. Yes.
My name is Valinda Joseph. I'm Managing Director, BJ Construction, one of the 5 big retailers of concrete masonry units in the country. Now, first, before putting a question, let me commend AFR. At least this research has brought out something that we have been missing for some good time. I think Charles will support me. We have been this for so many years, but I think that part of those low income people have not been always talked about in such conferences. So I commend them for that. But then my question comes. They talked when you look at their report, the low income is below 500,000. I wish the guys of the National Statistics Institute of this country could give us data. I think we would be talking of those below 200,000 Rwanda francs. That would be the actual thing. And those are the majority of our citizens who actually are in dire need of housing. The guys who earn 500,000 in this country can try, but the guys who earn below 200,000 are in dire need. So could you at least do some more input to give us statistics on these guys and how they can get finance for housing?
Great, thank you very much. Charles, is there one more question? I saw right in front of you, and then we'll close it and we'll answer all of those questions. So is everyone taking notes?
Yeah, thank you, Kay. Thank you very much. This is Eddie. Just a quick question to ask, maybe Jan Bosco will help us. Something to do with the financing side. I would be interested if you might have made an assessment on the the irregular income cases, where I'm really interested in knowing how you can support the non-traditional income earners in this case, because I believe there's also a very big chunk of them. You won't expect incomes that will be regular every month, but they have to be, again, supported in terms of accessing housing. Be interested in that. Thank you.
Great question, thank you. Can I ask Ilana to start with the demand side question? Ilana, are you still there?
I am indeed.
Oh, good.
Can you hear me?
Yes, so there were a couple questions around the demand side data, about the segmentation around it, also levels of home ownership in urban and rural areas. Did you hear those, and can you answer to those?
I did indeed. Yes. So as I mentioned, actually, it depends on which data source you're looking at. If you look at the ERCV, which is sort of more detailed income and expenditure survey, you'll see a slightly higher percentage of urban households rent, so closer to 50% would be renting, whereas in FinScope we're getting closer to 30%, 25 to 30% who are renting. So it just depends on the income source, and that's the data source, excuse me, and that's just the nature of the data that we're working with. So survey data by nature is like that. I think we've done some other studies in other countries on rental markets per se, and I think it's a really interesting area because, as Fatu was saying, there's no visibility on it. So particularly where rentals are in sort of unplanned areas, there's no data on that, and you kind of have to take a specific lens to it and really look at different ways of collecting data. We did a lot of web scraping, which we did for this project as well. And I think that some of that data is in the more detailed reports. So it does get quite tricky. And then I think this question, well, what is the demand? What is the need? What is the demand? Well, it's very difficult to kind of figure out what effective demand actually looks like. And that's where the affordability constraint really comes in. So it's one thing to say that we've got a significant percentage of households with a visible housing need. And as I mentioned, a lot of that is actually a deficit arising from access to sanitation, which is not something that households themselves can often sort of, although there are lots of off-grid solutions that we could look at. But again, in an urban context, in a high dense, in a dense sort of settlement, not typically what we would see. So I think this question of what is the need for housing versus what is effective demand, that's a very different question. But again, I would point you to the research documents, in particular the question on households who earn less than 200,000. There's, that's a very big segment of the market. So the data, the survey data that we've got on that segment is quite rich, and you can see quite a bit about who's in that segment, what the households look like, what the income sources are, and so on. I think just to add another dimension is that we can look at the here and now in Rwanda. I think a lot of the thinking that we were trying to engage with in the team was, what does the future look like? I think it is a leap of faith, but I think if we've got faith in something on the continent, it would be that that some of these growth targets will be achieved, that there really is a will to see Rwanda move into a middle-income country by 2050. And I think that positioning the supply and the financing sector for the now versus positioning it for sort of 10 years down the line is an important consideration to bring into the conversation as well.
Okay, thank you. Fatu, do you want to comment quickly on the question around quality? I thought that was an interesting question.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. That is a real challenge, especially in some of the lower submarkets. And so one of the things we were thinking of is if some of these micro developers, if we want to start to empower them with certain specific financial products, that financial product should be, access to that should be contingent upon proper training, business management courses, quality assurance, things like that, so that they can get that finance at a reasonable rate that would allow them to develop more housing. Also, with respect to the submarkets, I forgot to give you guys the name. Submarket 2 is called backyard landlord, precisely because those people, they own a piece of land precisely to rent it. It is their primary income activity. And if we're really going to be able to stimulate them to do something else and actually deliver formal housing or more housing, we have to be able to understand what's the current return on the investment that they're making. And they're immediately making cash off of this. If they're the incentive for starting to go formal, we have to be able to see that they can actually get the same returns, because that's essentially what their families are living off of. And so I think I just did some quick, they're making at least 20% ROI immediately once you open the door and rent the room for $5,000 or $10,000. And so getting a mortgage or a specific product, if it's costing them more than to do that, they simply won't do it. I don't think I would either. So those are additional calculations and business models that can now be done per submarket to be able to help the policymakers design the proper policy to address these small developers. Did I answer the question? I think so. I hope so.
Great. And Yachu, do you want to close us off?
Yes, thank you very much. Just quickly on Joseph's and my friend last question. When we said below 500,000, it's really, so it's inclusive of below 200,000. So we are not excluding that. We want really to do the hard thing and understand the patterns across different income brackets. And I totally agree that the majority is there, and we need to understand how can they be served. I think this last question is also connected to that, because majority of those have really irregular incomes and coming from different streams. So how do you bring visibility to that? Because that's very critical for the lender to comfortably provide financing. So we shall assess that and make sure that we bring that visibility and see what can be the solutions. And as I close, I just give you an example on saving for old age, the pension schemes across Africa. So we have them for the formal sector. And across different countries, you find that the formal sector is between 6 to 15%. You have more than 85% of people that are working in the informal sector, and they are not saving for old age. And that's a big problem. When they get old, they become a burden to you and the government. So in Rwanda, we came up with one solution, an informal sector pension scheme that actually takes care of those income patterns. Smallholder farmers that harvest twice or 3 times a year, how do they save actually when they're harvesting? rather than impose them to contribute something every month that they don't have. So we need to be very innovative and come up with such solutions, even in this sector, because when you look at the assets under management for this scheme, it's almost half. And it's 3 years now, almost half what the formal sector has contributed for the last so many years. So it's possible actually to look at solutions that are out of the box. It's possible. So that's what we want to do with you. We learn, we see what is feasible and what is not feasible. Yes, that's where you recommend to the policymaker, to the government, say this is so short of actually housing. Can you do something about it? But the rest, I believe they are low income and they can participate in the affordable housing finance market. Thank you.
Exactly. Thank you so much. That was really great, a nice discussion. And I would really urge you all to take a look at the report. It is hugely detailed. It goes on forever. In fact, there are, I think, 8 or 9 reports together. Detailed profiling of the different demand side segments and the supply side segments. Lots of data in there to interrogate further. So if you didn't get the URL, I'm sure you can just ask Yachu.
I can share it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kesha.
And thank you, Ilana. Thank you for the contribution.
Thank you so much.
Great.
Bosco Fatu, thank you so much. Very, very insightful. Access to finance. You know, some of the things that you're saying, having been here all morning, everything is just being pieced together. They tell us 75% of people in the urban settings do not buy houses, but they build for themselves. So then I ask myself, Zay Solomon and the other guys who are doing SCAT technologies, I also met another lady doing an amazing technology from Austria. And you ask, in our own typical African setting, what is the likelihood of you going for alternative technology to build for yourself? So is it probably that the percentage of people who are building for themselves, and probably have a very interesting session on finance tomorrow with the banks to understand whether as KCB mortgages or the other guys in the house, how many of your mortgages are from people, are construction loans or people buying into housing developments? I think that is a very interesting one. Thank you, Fatu and Bosco.